بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So this is lesson number 13, the 13th lesson in this series on Kitab al-Uboodiyyah of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. And in the previous lesson we finished on the point that from the traits of the polytheists, is that they, first of all, they innovate things into religion. They innovate affairs into the religion. And secondly, they use al-qadar as an argument. So they use al-qadar as an argument to justify their deeds, their shirk, their polytheism, and the various actions that they do. So they invoke al-qadar as an argument to prove that they are correct, that they must be correct. Otherwise, why would Allah Azza wa Jal will for them to do these things if He is unpleased with them, if He's not pleased with them? So these two qualities Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned, that these are the two ways in which these people go astray. And he's moving on to mention that this is also the way that people from within Islam, that this is how they also go astray, because they resemble the ways of those polytheists. So either they innovate things into the religion of beliefs, of actions, of worship, of laws and things like that. So they innovate, they make ibtida', or they use al-qadar as an argument to justify their sin or their misguidance and to validate that misguidance. This is something that happened within the Muslim nation, and he goes on to explain that this is something that we find amongst the Sufis, first of all, as a sect, as a group with an orientation, and secondly among the people of Kalam, the Ahlul Kalam, those people who refer to or who rely upon logic and reason and philosophy, and they make that to be the foundation in their speech in the affairs of religion, particularly in the affairs of creed. So what they have done is that they have resembled the way of the polytheists. And so this is what Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah is going to mention next. And so this is the commencement of this lesson, lesson number 13. So he says, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, that mentioning the verses. So first of all, he mentioned the verses that we finished off the previous lesson with, because they said, Allah Azza wa Jal, He says about the polytheists, وَإِذَا فَعَلُوا فَاحِشَةً قَالُوا وَجَدْنَا عَلِيهَا آبَاءَنَا وَاللَّهُ أَمَرَنَا بِهَا قُلْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَأْمُرُ بِالْفَحْشَاءِ أَتَقُولُونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. So the pagans would do an evil deed, such as they used to walk around naked around the Kaaba, and they would say that this is what we found our forefathers upon. Our forefathers used to be upon this. And Allah Azza wa Jal, He's the one, that Allah is the one who commanded us with this. So Allah Azza wa Jal refuted them and said, told the Messenger of Allah to say, indeed Allah does not command that which is shameful. He doesn't command the fahsha. And are you saying upon Allah that of which you have no knowledge? So that's the first thing. They innovated things, turned them into the religion, and claimed that they are simply following the religion and the way of their forefathers. And also Allah Azza wa Jal said of them, سَيَقُولُ الَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا لَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ مَا أَشْرَكْنَا وَلَا آبَاؤُنَا وَلَا حَرَّمْنَا مِنْ شَيْءٍ. So they, the polytheists, will say, those who committed shirk, they will say, if Allah had so willed, we would not have committed shirk, and nor would our forefathers, and nor would we have declared anything to be unlawful. So in other words, the argument now is that, if our religion is false, if what we are upon is false, then Allah wouldn't have willed that. He wouldn't have willed it. He wouldn't have willed us to commit shirk, and nor to make things, halal or haram, because, he must be pleased with these affairs. Otherwise, why has He willed them upon us? So you can see from these things that, first of all, they used Al-Qadr as an argument to validate their religion and their actions of innovation. And likewise, they claimed that it is Allah who commanded them with some of these, alleged acts of worship that they used to perform. So Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, after mentioning these verses, which mention these things, he then says that قال الشيخ وقد ذكر عن المشركين ما ابتدعوه من الدين الذي فيه تحليل الحرام والعبادة التي لم يشرعها الله بمثل قوله تعالى. So basically he says that Allah has mentioned about the pagans, the polytheists, what they've innovated into the religion, and in which they make the haram to be halal, and in which they declare acts of worship which Allah hasn't legislated. And then he goes on to mention some other verses in the Quran that mention the same thing. So for example, in another verse of the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, وَقَالُوا هَذِهِ أَنْعَامٌ وَحَرْثٌ حِجْرٌ لَا يَطْعَمُهَا إِلَّا مَنْ نَشَاءُ بِزَعْمِهِمْ وَأَنْعَامٌ حُرِّمَتْ ظُهُورُهَا وَأَنْعَامٌ لا يذكرون اسم الله عليها افتراء عليه. So basically in another verse it is mentioned again that the polytheists they basically say that, look, these are some of our crops and these are some of our animals and they are forbidden. They will not be eaten by anybody. They will not be eaten by anybody except whom we will. Now, the meaning of this, as Sheikh Salih Al-Fawzan explains, is that the polytheists, what they used to do is that they used to gather together the crops and they used to gather together some of their livestock, the animals, and then they would devote some of them to their idols and devote others to Allah Azza wa Jal. And as for those that they would devote to Allah Azza wa Jal, they wouldn't eat those things, right? They would consider them to be sacred, and they wouldn't eat these things, and they would say, this is for Allah, this is for Allah. And then they would consider this to be an act of worship, And also we see in another verse, وَجَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ مِمَّا ذَرَأَ مِنَ الْحَرْثِ وَالْأَنْعَامِ نَصِيبًا فَقَالُوا هَذَا لِلَّهِ بِزَعْمِهِمْ وَهَذَا لِشُرَكَائِنَا. That they would take the crops and the animals, the livestock, and they would make a portion for it for Allah Azza wa Jal. They would make a portion and say, this is for Allah, by their claim. And this other portion is for our partners, meaning the deities that they worship. So basically what they would do is take the crops, the herbage, the things that they would harvest and collect together, and then they would take the animals, and they would say, one portion of this we are now going to devote to Allah, another portion of this we are going to devote to the idols. And all of this is something that's purely something from themselves. And they would invent this, from themselves. And they would say that they turn this into an act of devotion. And all of this is an innovation. Allah Azza wa Jal didn't command them to do any such thing. And so they would say that these animals that we've devoted to Allah Azza wa Jal, we are not going to eat from them. We are not going to ride these animals. We are not going to allow anybody else to do that. So, in other words, they are making things which Allah has actually made halal for them. They're now making them haram. Right, by way of these, ideas that they are inventing and innovating, and by which they are thinking that they are, venerating Allah Azza wa Jal. But Allah did not command them with this. Allah Azza wa Jal didn't say to them, take your crops and take your animals, and so a portion of them put them to one side and devote them to me. Don't eat them, don't drink their milk, don't ride upon them, don't do anything like that, because they are sacred and devoted to me, but you can eat from the others. This is pure invention. And so this is what they would do. They would invent these affairs, make the halal into haram, make the haram into halal, and things like that. And so this is the way of the pagans. So Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, as Shaykh al-Fawzan has explained here, so Ibn Taymiyyah continues and he says, likewise we see in many other verses, in many other chapters of the Quran, we see something very similar. And then he goes on to mention a series of verses. He says, Ya bani Adam, la yaftinannakum ash-shaytan, kama akhraja abawaykum min al-jannah. O son of Adam, do not let the shaitan put you to trial, just as he expelled your parents from paradise. So here, the meaning is that in this ayah, Allah Azza wa Jal has mentioned about Iblis and how he whispered to Adam alayhi salam and his wife alayhi salam, and he wanted them to obey him. So he basically wanted to, expose their aura. He wants to expose their private parts and to remove that, that from them. And so he convinced them to eat from the tree, which they had been prohibited from. And as a result of that, their aura became apparent to them. And that's why Allah Azza wa Jal, he said in this ayah, Ya bani Adam, لا يفتننكم الشيطان كما أخرج أبويكم من الجنة ينزع عنهما لباسهما ليريهما سوآتهما. So he expelled them from paradise and, removing their garment from them so that their aura would be, would be exposed. So what's happened here is Allah Azza wa Jal is informing us in this ayah that to uncover the aura, to expose the aura of a man or a woman, this is something that Iblis and his followers, this is what they want. And this is what you find today in these days, as the Shaykh says, that those who are the al-mustaghribun, those who basically want to westernize, bring the Western culture into our societies and to our countries. And they are the ones who basically call to this nakedness and to removing the hijab and to, uncovering the hijab and to, free mixing between the men and the women. And all of that, by way of this, it's as if they want to change the ni'mah and the favor that we find in the Muslim lands, where basically there is, decency and morality and nobility and dignity, of men and women by virtue of the way that they dress and conceal their aura and so on and so forth. And this is a ni'mah that Allah Azza wa Jal has bestowed upon the believers, the believing servants. As Allah Azza wa Jal, He says in the Quran, Ya bani Adam, قد أنزلنا عليكم لِبَاسًا يُوَارِي سَوْآتِكُمْ وَرِيشًا وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ ذَلِكَ مِنْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَذَّكَّرُونَ. He says, O Bani Adam, O children of Adam, we have sent upon you garments, by which you conceal your aura, your private parts, and, garments, clothing. And as for the garment of taqwa, as for the clothing of taqwa, that is better. And that is from the signs of Allah, in order that you may be admonished. So we have the garment, which is the physical clothing, but there's also the garment of taqwa, of piety, of fearing Allah. And that is also a garment that we can wear, that we can put on by doing what He commanded and keeping away from what He prohibited. So Shaykh al-Fawzan says that al-libas, clothing, is of two types. One type which is for concealing the aura, and the other type which is for beautification. So clothing has two objectives. One is to conceal your aura, to conceal your private parts, and secondly, to for the purpose of beautification and adornment and having a nice, pleasant appearance. So all of these are from the favors of Allah Azza wa Jal, as the Shaykh says, وَهَذَا مِن نِعَمِ اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. These are from the favors and bounties of Allah. فَاللِّبَاسِ وَالتَّزَيُّن, clothing and adornment and concealing the aura, all of it is from the bounties of Allah. However, we see that the shayateen, the devils, the mushrikeen, the polytheists and pagans, from the jinn and from the men, they basically claim that all of this is basically extremism and being severe and being intense, and and this is what we find the contemporary nations to be upon this way of thinking. They consider it nothing that a man or a woman exposes his or her aura and reveals what should actually be concealed. So he mentions this verse, then he mentions also other verses in the Quran. For example, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْرِفِينَ. Eat and drink and do not exceed the bounds. Indeed, Allah does not love those who exceed the bounds, meaning those who go into excess and exaggeration. So again, this is a verse to do with the law and being moderate and balanced in the law. Likewise, he quotes the verse in the Quran, قُلْ إِنَّمَا حَرَّمَ رَبِّيَ الْفَوَاحِشَ مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَمَا بَطَنَ وَالْإِثْمَ وَالْبَغْيَ وَبِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ وَأَن تُشْرِكُوا بِاللَّهِ مَا لَمْ يُنَزِّلْ بِهِ سُلْطَانًا وَأَن تَقُولُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. In this ayah, Allah Azza wa Jal says, say, my Lord has prohibited al-fawahish, meaning the shameful, lustful kind of deeds and behaviors and actions, that which is apparent from them and that which is hidden. And likewise, al-ithm, which is sin, and oppression, wal-baghi bighayr al-haqq, and oppression upon other than truth. And that you associate partners with Allah, that for which He gave you no authority. And finally, that you say upon Allah that of which you have no knowledge. So again, this verse mentions many things which Allah Azza wa Jal has prohibited. Now, what is the intent of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah in mentioning all of these verses at this point? The intent is that the Sharia, the legislation of Allah Azza wa Jal, has come with guidance, and it has come with the halal and the haram. And it is that which we follow in order to manage our conduct, to make sure that our conduct is the most upright type of conduct. Why? Because Allah Azza wa Jal, He's legislated the halal and the haram on the basis of, there are some things which are intrinsically beneficial and overwhelmingly beneficial, and there are some things which are intrinsically harmful or overwhelmingly harmful, and so He's prohibited those things, whether in terms of food, clothing, drink, actions, behaviors, traits, characteristics, interactions with others, trade dealings, things like that. So he gave us those things so that we can, conduct our behavior in the most upright of ways. It is not left to our intellect. It is not left to our tastes. It is not left to our desires. It is not left to our feelings. It is not left to our experiences. It is not left to our theories. Right? All of this is guidance from Allah Azza wa Jal, and it is the most upright of guidance. So this is his intent in mentioning these particular verses at this point in time. Then he goes on to discuss the way of these polytheists that we mentioned earlier on, who innovate into their religion, which is not from it, and they use al-qadr as an argument to justify their behavior. So you innovate into the religion, and you commit shirk, and you make the halal to be haram, or the haram to be halal, and then you claim this is all from Allah because He willed it, and He must be pleased with it, so our religion must be valid, what we are doing must be correct, otherwise why would Allah will this? So you can see this whole thing is basically a source and a means of misguidance. So after mentioning these verses and laying down these verses, he then moves on to discuss these people, like the Sufis and the people who went astray in this way. He says, وَهَؤُلَاءِ قَدْ يُسَمُّونَ مَا أَحْدَثُوهُ مِنَ الْبِدْعَةِ حَقِيقَةً كَمَا يُسَمُّونَ مَا يَشْهَدُونَ مِنَ الْقَدَرِ حَقِيقَةً. He says these people who, like the ones that we spoke about earlier, the Sufis, for example, who invent into the religion, and these innovations they invent, they say that these are the haqiqah. These innovations are the haqiqah, they are the reality. And likewise, whatever they see of al-qadr, they declare that to be the reality. What Ibn Taymiyyah is basically saying here is that there are some of these people who do not limit themselves to the sharia in the halal and the haram, and whatever things they innovate into the religion of religious affairs, of acts of worship, they call this the haqiqah. And likewise, whatever actions they do, right, they do sinful actions, acts of disobedience, they also call this haqiqah as well, meaning that this is from Allah's rububiyyah, and this is something Allah has willed, therefore it must be something Allah is pleased with. So therefore what we do of sins and disobedience, of, for example, drinking alcohol and fornicating, having unlawful relationships, and eating things which are haram, and doing all sorts of unlawful things, all of this is the haqiqah, it is the reality. Why? Because it is from Allah's al-qadr. And so they bring these two things together, the innovated actions they are doing in the religion which they have invented, and the sins and disobedience that they are doing, and they say all of this is the haqiqah, it is the reality. And then they distinguish between that and between the actual sharia, between the actual commands, the laws, the prohibitions of Allah Azza wa Jal. Why? Because as you recall, these people who are upon this way, the Sufis who believe in wahdatul wujud and al-ittihad and these kind of ideas and notions, they are of the view that the Sharia is for the common people. It is for the ignorant people. And the common people, the ignorant people, are the ones who have to abide by the Sharia, by the halal, by the haram, by the acts of worship. Why? Because they are too ignorant to know the higher truths, the philosophical truths, right? The hidden truths, the hidden type of knowledge. They don't know these things, so they have to just believe in, they have to be made to believe in things which are not true, like paradise and hellfire and, things like that. And so these things have to be told to them so that they follow these laws in order for them to be able to live a meaningful life, which is good for them. Right? This is the general idea. And as for them, meaning the elite, right, the elite philosophical people who have the intelligence to know the true reality, which they claim is that Allah is everything and everything is Allah and Allah is everywhere, and there's no distinction between the created and the creator, all of it is the same thing, right? This is the meaning of Tawheed to them. This is the true Tawheed, right? This is the real Tawheed. And so therefore, whatever is worshipped by anybody, the Hindu worshipping the elephant, the Hindu worshipping the idol, the Christian worshipping the cross, or worshipping Isa alayhi salam, right? And everything that whatever is worshipped, all of it is Allah. Everything is Allah. So therefore, there is no such thing as a true religion or a false religion. There's only one religion. It's worship whatever you want, right? It's all valid. Every path leads to Allah. And likewise, therefore, there can be no such thing as halal and haram, right? If everything is Allah, right, then the notion of lawful and unlawful doesn't even exist. So therefore, we, as they say, that we are the people who have recognized this truth because we are so intellectual, we are philosophical, we are able to realize these higher truths. So therefore, the Sharia is not for us. It's for the commoners. As for us, what we have is the haqiqah, the reality, right? So we've recognized the reality. So everything that we are doing in our behaviors and actions, that is the reality, right? So if we, for example, drink alcohol and fornicate and follow our lusts and desires and do whatever thing it is, all of that is the haqiqah. All of that is the reality. Why? Because nothing exists except Allah. Allah is everything. There's no creator and the created. It's all one thing. And so therefore, everything that takes place is through Allah's will, through Allah's pleasure, through Allah's satisfaction. So everything is haqiqah. Everything is the actual reality. Right? So this is a really twisted, evil saying of theirs, on account of which they speak with this type of language. And so they call what they are upon to be the haqiqah. The haqiqah. So in other words, to them, there is either the Sharia, which is what the common people follow, or there is the haqiqah, the reality, which is what they know and what they recognize and what they practice. And this is kind of like, in a way, if you look at the modern day philosophers and what we call the existentialists, these are the people who believe that, this life is all that it is, and basically in this life you've got to give it the best meaning, and you do whatever pleases you, right? The only truth is your truth. Whatever thing you consider to be the truth, that is your truth, and that's the only thing which exists. So therefore you follow that truth. You make that to be the truth. So for example, if a person comes along and he says, well, my truth is that basically I can smoke hashish and I can take drugs and I can sleep around, and basically that's my truth. That's my meaning. Right? This now is the truth. This is the haqiqah for that person. Right? So this idea or this notion, you see, when you follow your desires, when you follow your desires, your lusts, your feelings, your emotions, right? The things that make you feel good, the things that give you pleasure, the things that taste good, right? When you follow that, this is the type of misguidance that you are led to. And then you enter into all sorts of corrupt beliefs, corrupt ideas, corrupt feelings, corrupt actions and behavior that bring corruption in society. So these people that we are speaking of, the way in which they went astray, Ibn Taymiyyah says about these people that when we look at these people, he says, وَهَؤُلَاءِ لَا يَحْتَجُّونَ بِالْقَدَرِ مُطْلَقًا. He says these people, when we look at them, it's not the case that they are only using al-qadr as an argument. It's not that they are just saying, well, Allah decreed it, so therefore He must be pleased with it, therefore what I'm doing must be correct. But there's also another element to it as well. And the other element is that these people, they are also relying upon their opinions, right? And their desires, and whatever they, feel like, and whatever they desire, then they call all of that to be the haqiqah, to be the actual truth, to be the reality. So in other words, it is not Allah's legislation, His command, or what He sent to His messenger. That is not the criterion, right? It is argument by way of al-qadr, and likewise whatever their desires and their lusts and their feelings and their opinions and their rationalities, this now becomes the basis of religion for them. That is what becomes the truth. So in this respect, we said that this was the way of the polytheists, of the pagans, of the mushriks. And so we find from those who went astray among the Muslims, there are certain groups who follow the same, who went astray in the same way. And so we are discussing two groups of people. They are the Sufis, from the extreme Sufis, and likewise the people of kalam, the people of philosophy and rhetoric and rationalities. They made this to be the foundation of their religion. So Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he mentions then here that those polytheists, the way they went astray, we find the similarity among the people of kalam. The innovations of the people of kalam from the Jahmiyyah, and likewise, the same as the Sufis. He says these people, they innovated certain speech into the religion which opposes the Quran and the Sunnah, the book and the Sunnah. And, they use their intellects, and anything which then did not agree with their intellect, they either distorted its meaning, they distorted it, or they said, well, it has no meaning. It's a mystical meaning, it's an allegorical meaning, or we don't even know the meaning at all to begin with. So therefore we can never ever know the meaning. So either they distort the meaning and give it a faulty interpretation because it doesn't agree with their intellects, or they say it's impossible to know the meaning. There's no meaning to it at all. It's all just mystery, and it's best if we just leave it alone. So the point being here that the way that you go astray from the religion and oppose the legislation is either that you follow your lusts and desires and feelings, right? And so you engage in behaviors and actions and do things which you consider to be worship, but all of it is based upon your taste, your feeling, right? Your pleasure, your desire. That's one way. Or it can also happen in terms of creed, when basically you resort to rationalities, philosophy, opinions, ideas, right? And you make them to be the basis of speaking in matters of creed. So you go astray in that way, right? These are ways in which you depart from the religion. So therefore we see that one of the groups, in addition to the Sufis who we have been discussing, who went astray in the same way, are the people of kalam, the people of theological rhetoric, the people of philosophy. So, for example, the Jahmiyyah, Jahm bin Safwan, and Al-Ja'ad bin Dirham, and Al-Wasil bin Ata, these are the heads of the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila. And what they did is that they were influenced by Greek philosophy, the philosophy of Aristotle, of Plato, and they acquired this from the Jews, from the Christians, from the Sabaeans, and then they began to use the rationalities, the philosophy that exists in those amongst those nations, and they brought it into Islam, and they began to speak about Allah's names and His attributes by way of that. So they made this to be the foundation, as Sheikh Salih Al-Fawzan explains, that they made this to be the foundation. So they made the rules of logic, the rules of argumentation, right, and the principles of philosophy. They used them and they said, this is what provides certain evidence which we can rely upon and trust, because it gives you certainty, it gives you yaqeen, right? These are rational arguments, right? And they put these first. They say, these come first, these have precedence. And they put them ahead of the evidences of the Sharia. And then they say that the evidences of the Sharia don't really give us certainty. They are ambiguous. They are open to interpretation, right? They don't end the arguments. Whereas the argument of reason and philosophy and logic, it gives you certainty, right? So in this way, they innovated into the religion, just like the Sufis went astray in the affairs of worship and behavior and suluk. Then likewise, these people went astray in the affairs of aqidah, in the affairs of creed. So, as we said, they began to use philosophy, rules of logic, and they began to speak about Allah Azza wa Jal and His names and attributes. So when they came across certain verses, such as, for example, Allah Azza wa Jal mentioning that He ascended above the throne, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arshi istawa, or where He mentions that He created Adam alayhi salam with His own two hands, or that His face will remain, and verses of that nature, then they began to distort and interpret these verses in a way to negate the attributes. Why? Because these verses go against their principles of philosophy and logic and so on and so forth. And they began to give allegorical interpretations. And so whenever they were able to do that, they would do it with certain verses. And in other verses where it was not possible for them to do that, they simply said, well, these are just mysteries. These are just, we don't really know the true meaning. We don't really know what it is. So we are just going to basically assume ignorance. We are going to submit the knowledge of it to Allah Azza wa Jal. And so this they call at-tafweed, at-tafweed. So either they make ta'weel, which is the distortion, the allegorical interpretation, and if they're not able to do that, they will make tafweed, which is to say, well, nobody knows its meaning. It's impossible to know the meaning. So therefore we simply leave it to Allah Azza wa Jal. So in this way, these people went astray and they deviated from the way of the Salaf. And the mistake that they made is that they assumed that the intellect is able to grasp all realities. They assumed that the intellect, is able to understand everything. And this is not true, because there are certain affairs from the unseen that the intellect is unable to grasp. And so therefore, when the Sharia, when the legislation, when the revelation has come and has informed us about those realities, then we have to accept them, that they are realities, and then we affirm them, without basically negating them, without making likenesses for them, without distorting them. This is what we follow. There's a methodology. But these people, they basically fell into a mistake, and they made their opinions and their rationalities, their philosophy, to be the foundation, and then the Sharia to be a branch, right? And they evaluated the Sharia, by way of their philosophy, right? And then they either distorted it, or they claimed it is just, mystical and nobody can really know the meaning at all. So the point being that by giving an example of these two groups, the Sufis, who speak about the haqiqah and the sharia, and those, how they follow their desires, their feelings, their inclinations, their tastes and things like that, right? This is what they follow in doing whatever they do, and then they justify it by way of al-qadr, and they call all of that haqiqah. This is very similar to the modern day, the philosophers and existentialists, those who believe that, whatever you pursuing your pleasure is your truth. That is the truth, right? And likewise, the example of the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiyyah, who basically went astray by way of the issue of reason and philosophy and rationalities, and they made that to be the foundation, and they pursued their religion by way of those tools and those instruments, and so they went astray as well. They, went astray in a great way by way of that. So what we'll do is we'll finish our lesson at this point, because then Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he goes on to continue the discussion. We'll leave that for the next lesson. He continues to discuss the issue of how a person, sometimes he can be inclined towards his desires and his feelings, and sometimes he uses those as a basis, in his judgments and in what he does and in what he chooses. So that topic, inshallah, we'll leave it. We'll continue with it in the next lesson, and we'll conclude our lesson here for today. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.